What happens when one of the most recognizable figures in the world walks onto a morning show set and completely unravels on live television? It only took 33 seconds after one pointed question for Prince Harry to go from composed royal to a man who would be physically escorted off the Good Morning America set, banned from ever returning. This was supposed to be a simple interview. George Stephanopoulos, the veteran journalist who has interviewed presidents, prime ministers, and world leaders, was sitting across from Prince Harry in the bright studio. The cameras were rolling. Millions of Americans were watching from their living rooms, kitchens, and offices. Nobody expected what was about to unfold. George started with what seemed like a straightforward question. Your Highness, you've spoken extensively about privacy and the intrusion of the media into your life. Yet you've also chosen to share incredibly personal details in interviews, documentaries, and your memoir. How do you reconcile those two positions? Prince Harry shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. Well, George, I think that's a bit of a simplistic way to frame a very complex situation. George nodded, maintaining his professional composure. I'm just trying to understand the distinction you're making between acceptable and unacceptable public disclosure. The distinction, Harry said, his voice rising slightly, is that I get to control my own narrative. I get to decide what parts of my story are told and when. But doesn't the public have a legitimate interest in the activities of someone who was funded by taxpayer money for decades? George asked calmly. Harry's face flushed red. Funded? You make it sound like I was on welfare. My family has given centuries of service to this country. George remained steady, his voice even. I'm not diminishing that service. I'm simply asking about the balance between privacy and public accountability. You know what your problem is, George. Harry leaned forward, pointing his finger. You sit there in your comfortable chair, pretending to be objective, but you're just another mouthpiece for the establishment. The studio went quiet. George's eyebrows raised slightly, but his voice stayed calm. I'm asking you the questions that our viewers want answered. That's my job. Your job, Harry scoffed, is to protect the status quo. You're too afraid to ask the real questions about the institution that destroyed my mother, that drove my wife to the brink, that treats people like commodities. George took a breath. Prince Harry, I've asked you direct questions about your own choices and contradictions. Those are real questions. If you'd prefer to discuss your family's treatment of you and your wife, we can certainly do that. But you'll need to answer the questions I'm asking first. Don't patronize me, Harry snapped. I've been dealing with people like you my entire life. People who smile to your face while sharpening their knives behind their backs. I'm not sharpening any knives, George said firmly. I'm conducting an interview. If that feels like an attack to you, perhaps you should ask yourself why. Harry stood up suddenly, his microphone pack jerking against the wire. Perhaps you should ask yourself why you're so invested in tearing down someone who's actually trying to make a difference in the world. George remained seated, his hands folded on the desk. Please sit down. We're in the middle of an interview. No, Harry said, his voice getting louder. I'm done being treated like this. I came here in good faith, and you're treating me like a criminal. I'm treating you like any other guest, George replied. I ask tough questions. That's what journalism is. Harry laughed bitterly. Journalism? Is that what you call this? This is a hit job. This was planned from the beginning. George's expression remained neutral. Every question I've asked you today was sent to your team in advance. You approved this interview. You knew what we were going to discuss. I approved a conversation, Harry shot back. Not an interrogation. There's a difference, George, though I wouldn't expect you to understand that. Help me understand then, George said. What question have I asked that was unfair? Harry paced beside his chair, his hands gesturing wildly. It's not about the specific questions. It's about the tone. It's about the skepticism dripping from every word you say. It's about the way you look at me, like I'm some kind of joke." "I don't think you're a joke," George said quietly. "I think you're a public figure who has made certain claims, and I'm asking you to explain and defend those claims. That's not disrespect. That's accountability." "Accountability?" Harry's voice cracked. "You want to talk about accountability? Where's the accountability for the tabloids that hacked my phone? Where's the accountability for the journalists who chased my mother to her death? Where's the accountability for the system that protects abusers and silences victims?" George leaned forward slightly. "Those are all valid issues that deserve investigation and discussion. But right now, we're talking about your choices, your statements, and your actions. You can't deflect every question about your behavior by pointing to someone else's wrongdoing." "My behavior?" Harry was shouting now. "What about your behavior, George? What about your network's behavior? You're all part of the same corrupt system." A producer's voice could be heard off camera, trying to calm things down. George raised a hand to indicate he had it under control. "Prince Harry, I'm going to ask you one more time to sit down and continue this conversation in a respectful manner," George said, his voice firm but not aggressive. "Respectful?" Harry laughed again. "You wouldn't know respect if it hit you in the face. You're just like all the rest of them. You're just another puppet doing what? You're told." George stood up now, his patience clearly wearing thin, but his professionalism intact. "I am not a puppet. I am a journalist with 4 decades of experience. I have interviewed everyone from presidents to dissidents to revolutionaries. I have asked difficult questions to people far more powerful than you, and not once have I been a puppet." "Then prove it," Harry challenged. "Prove you're not just reading from a script designed to make me look bad." "I don't need to prove anything to you," George said evenly. "My work speaks for itself. But you need to prove that you can handle basic scrutiny without falling apart." Harry's face went from red to purple. "How dare you? How dare you speak to me that way?" "I'm speaking to you the way I would speak to any guest who is acting inappropriately," George responded. "Your title doesn't give you the right to be abusive." "Abusive?" Harry sputtered. "I'm being abusive? You've been attacking me from the moment I sat down." "I asked you questions," George said slowly, as if explaining to a child. "Questions are not attacks. Disagreement is not abuse. Holding you accountable is not persecution." Harry grabbed his microphone pack and ripped it off, the wire snapping. "I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by someone who has no idea what I've been through." "You're right," George said. "I don't know exactly what you've been through, but I do know that you agreed to come on this program. You agreed to answer questions, and now you're throwing a tantrum because you don't like being challenged." "A tantrum?" Harry's voice reached a new pitch. "You think this is a tantrum? I'll show you a tantrum." He grabbed the glass of water from the desk, and for a moment, everyone in the studio held their breath, thinking he might throw it. Instead, he slammed it down, water splashing across the desk and onto George's notes. George didn't flinch. He calmly moved his papers aside and looked directly at Harry. "That was childish." "You're childish," Harry shot back, and immediately the absurdity of his own response seemed to register on his face. "This interview is over," George said, standing up straight. "I think you need to leave." "Oh, I'm leaving," Harry said. "Don't worry about that. But everyone watching needs to know what kind of person you really are, George. You're a coward. You hide behind your desk and your reputation, but you're just a coward." George's voice remained steady. "I'm going to ask you to leave the studio now. Security will escort you out if necessary." "Security?" Harry looked around wildly. "You're going to have me removed by security? Like I'm some kind of threat." "You just threw water across my desk," George pointed out. "Your behavior has been erratic and aggressive. Yes, if you don't leave voluntarily, security will escort you out." Harry seemed to deflate slightly, reality setting in. "This is unbelievable. This is absolutely unbelievable." "What's unbelievable," George said, "is that you came here, agreed to an interview, and then melted down when asked basic questions about your public statements. That's what's unbelievable. Harry started walking toward the exit, then turned back. You know what, George? I feel sorry for you. I really do. You've sold your soul for a paycheck and a pat on the head from your corporate masters. George didn't take the bait. Goodbye, Prince Harry. Don't worry, Harry said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I won't be coming back to this joke of a show. That's probably for the best, George replied calmly. Harry stood there for a moment, as if waiting for George to say something else, to engage further. But George simply sat back down at his desk and began organizing his water-damaged notes. That's it? Harry asked. You have nothing else to say? George looked up, his expression neutral. What would you like me to say? I don't know, Harry admitted, seeming lost. An apology, maybe? George shook his head slowly. I have nothing to apologize for. I did my job. You're the one who lost control. I lost control because you pushed me, Harry insisted. No, George said firmly. You lost control because you couldn't handle being asked to explain yourself. There's a difference. Harry's hands clenched into fists. You're twisting everything. I'm not twisting anything, George said. The cameras have been recording this entire exchange. America just watched you have a breakdown on live television. There's no twisting necessary. The mention of the cameras seemed to shake Harry. He looked around at the crew, at the cameras still recording, at the shocked faces of the producers and staff members. This isn't over, Harry said, but his voice had lost its force. Yes, it is, George replied. This interview is over. Your appearance on this show is over. Please leave. A security guard appeared at the edge of the set, not threatening, just present. Harry looked at the guard, then back at George. You're really going to do this? Harry asked, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. You're really going to make me do this, George corrected. You had every opportunity to conduct yourself professionally. You chose not to. Harry took a step toward George, and immediately the security guard moved forward. Harry stopped. I'm not going to hurt him, Harry said to the guard. I just want to talk. We've done enough talking, George said. Please escort him out. The security guard approached Harry carefully. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me. Harry looked at the guard, then at George, then at the cameras. His shoulders slumped. This is humiliating. Yes, George agreed. It is. And it was entirely avoidable. Harry let the security guard take his arm gently. As he was led toward the exit, he called back over his shoulder. You haven't heard the last of this, George? George didn't look up from his notes. I'm sure I haven't. The studio doors closed behind Prince Harry and the security guard. For a moment, there was absolute silence on the set. George sat at his desk, calmly blotting the water from his papers with a tissue. The crew members stood frozen, unsure of what to do or say. Finally, George looked up at the camera. We're going to take a commercial break. When we come back, we'll have our scheduled cooking segment with Chef Maria Rodriguez. His voice was steady, professional, as if nothing unusual had just happened. The director called for a cut, and the studio erupted in shocked conversation. George removed his own microphone and stood up. His producer rushed over. George, are you okay? She asked. He nodded. I'm fine. Make sure legal reviews that footage before anything airs. The whole thing was live, she reminded him. George closed his eyes briefly. Right. Well, then make sure we have clean copies of everything. We'll need them. Another producer approached. What do you want to do about the rest of the show? George checked his watch. How much time do we have left? 42 minutes. Then we do 42 minutes of television, George said simply. We have a cooking segment, a book review, and a piece on the new museum exhibit. We do the show. But shouldn't we address what just happened? The producer asked. George considered this. At the end of the show, I'll make a brief statement. Something simple and factual. But we're not going to spend the whole hour dissecting it. That's not what our viewers tuned in for. The makeup artist approached to check George's appearance. You've got a little water spot on your tie. George looked down and smiled slightly. Battle scars. As the crew prepared for the return from commercial, George sat back down at his desk. He took a sip from a fresh glass of water that someone had brought him. His hands were steady. The floor director counted down. And we're back in 5, 4, 3. He finished the count silently with his fingers. George looked into the camera, his expression warm and professional. Welcome back to Good Morning America. I hope you're having a wonderful morning. Coming up next, Chef Maria Rodriguez is here to show us how to make the perfect summer pasta salad. But first, let me just say a few words about what you just witnessed. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Our job as journalists is to ask questions. Sometimes those questions are uncomfortable. Sometimes our guests don't like them. That's okay. It's part of the process. What's not okay is when disagreement turns into disrespect, when conversation turns into confrontation. We always hope our interviews will be productive and civil, but occasionally, as you just saw, that's not possible. George took a breath. We invited Prince Harry here to discuss his work, his life, and his perspectives. We prepared thoughtful questions. We gave his team full advance notice of our topics. What happened was unfortunate, but it was a choice he made. We will always stand by our commitment to honest, tough, fair journalism, and we will always treat our guests with respect, even when they don't extend that same courtesy to us. He smiled then, genuine and warm. Now, let's talk about pasta salad, because honestly, after that, we could all use some comfort food. Chef Maria, come on out. The chef appeared, all smiles, and the show continued as if the previous segment had been just another day at the office. But everyone watching knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen a master journalist remain calm under pressure. They had seen a public figure completely lose composure. They had seen the difference between professionalism and entitlement play out in real time. George conducted the rest of the show flawlessly. He laughed with the chef, engaged thoughtfully with the book critic, showed genuine interest in the museum curator's discussion of the new exhibit. He was everything a morning show host should be: warm, intelligent, curious, and unflappable. When the show ended and the cameras stopped rolling, George finally allowed himself a moment. He sat at his desk, loosened his tie, and let out a long breath. His executive producer sat down next to him. That was incredible, George, the way you handled that. George shrugged. It's not the first time someone's lost their temper with me. Won't be the last. But he's a prince, the producer said. He's a person, George corrected. A person who needs to learn that his title doesn't exempt him from being asked hard questions. A person who needs to understand that criticism isn't persecution. Do you think he'll understand that? The producer asked. George smiled sadly. Probably not. But that's not my problem. My problem is doing good journalism. And that's what I did today. The producer stood up. The phones are ringing off the hook. Social media is exploding. This is going to be everywhere. I'm sure it will be, George said. But tomorrow, we'll be back here, doing another show, asking more questions, holding more people accountable. That's the job. He stood up, gathered his things, and walked off the set. Behind him, the crew was already breaking down equipment, preparing for the next day. In studios across the country, in newsrooms and living rooms and office break rooms, people were talking about what they had just seen. They were talking about the prince who couldn't handle a simple interview. They were talking about the journalist who never lost his cool. They were talking about the moment when entitlement met accountability and accountability won. George didn't care about being the hero of the story. He cared about doing his job well. And today, despite everything, despite the water and the shouting and the security guard, he had done exactly that. The story would be told and retold. The clips would be shared and analyzed. The think pieces would be written. The Social media debates would rage on. But for George Stephanopoulos, it was just another day of asking questions that needed to be asked, of holding powerful people accountable, of doing the work of journalism. And when Prince Harry had challenged him, when the pressure was on, when the cameras were rolling and millions were watching, George had done what he always did. He stayed calm. He stayed professional. He stayed true to his principles. That was the real story. Not the tantrum, not the drama, not the security escort. The real story was about a journalist who understood that his job wasn't to make guests comfortable. It was to make them answer for their words and actions. It was to seek truth, even when truth was uncomfortable. George walked to his dressing room, closed the door, and sat down. He looked at himself in the mirror. There was a small water stain on his shirt that the camera probably hadn't caught. Evidence of the chaos that had unfolded. He smiled at his reflection. Tomorrow, there would be new guests, new questions, new challenges. Tomorrow, he would be back at that desk, doing what he did best. And if another guest decided to lose control, he would handle it the same way he had handled it today, with dignity, with professionalism, with an unwavering commitment to the truth, because that was who George Stephanopoulos was. And no amount of royal tantrums, thrown water, or entitled outbursts would ever change that.